Happy Sunday, everyone. I want you to think back to your childhood. I'm curious if family home evening was a part of your life, was something that your family strived for, tried to be consistent with, and whether your family was consistent with it and intentional about it or not. I think you would agree that growing up, whenever that was for you, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, that it was definitely a thing. It was part of church culture. It was part of tradition and practice, and some might even say doctrine, that Latter-day Saints were consistently encouraged to practice family home evening over and over and over and over again. And so I was thinking the other day about how that's changed. Well, if it's changed, and if so, why and when and all the things, right? How? And initially, my theory was, and yours might be, that Come Follow Me kind of replaced family home evening, right? Because historically, there was this very consistent, like Monday night is family home evening, no church meetings on Monday nights. This is what we're all doing. It's very important. You got scripture study and temple attendance and family home evening, and it was part of the cadence of being a, faithful and active Latter-day Saint. But I dug into some of the data to try and, sniff out a trend of how often family home evening has been inculcated or encouraged. And what I found leads me to conclude that Come Follow Me is not the reason why family home evening kind of died. So I'm going to share a little bit of the data that I gathered. Like with the abortion musing I did last year, you may recall. And for those of you who didn't see that or missed other ones, you can go to sundaymusings.org and catch up. When I did that abortion one, I did something similar. I dug into all the general conference addresses and I searched for, keywords. In that case, I was focusing on abortion stuff. And then tried to kind of chart decade over decade how many mentions there are to assess, are we not talking about these things anymore? Ultimately, my conclusion and my theory for this issue is that we're generally good at prioritizing what we're constantly reminded to do. And so if we're not constantly reminded to do something, it falls off our radar. And because as a culture, we've become so fixated on, following the words of a living prophet, many people, I think, implicitly assume that if it's not being actively taught, then it's less important. Because if it was important, it would be mentioned. And so something that hasn't been mentioned in 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, 50 years, doesn't really require my attention. Maybe it was opinions of past leaders. Maybe it's no longer relevant for the day that we're in, whatever excuses you might want to come up with. So we become fixated on the present to the detriment of the past, where we say, oh, well, again, if family home meeting was really important, we'd still be hearing about it. So maybe priorities have shifted. Maybe something else is afoot. So what does the data say? Well, family home evening was kind of originated about a century ago, a little over a century ago, and wasn't called family home evening at the time. It was really with President David McKay where things kind of, really congealed, and the whole Monday night thing and the consistency about it and calling it family home evening. And so that was 1970 when the church designated Monday as the official night for family home evening. So then I went, like I did with the abortion episode, I went into all the general conference, kind of the database. For those who haven't seen it, it's scripture. What I use, there's others I'm sure, I use scriptures.byu.edu. And on the very lower right hand of the screen, there's a search magnifying glass icon that you can click to search through general conference addresses, journal discourses, whatever. So obviously what I've done here is not like a massively rigorous, highly detailed thing. I'm just trying to get a gut check for how often is this being mentioned in general conference. So in the 70s, family home evening is mentioned over 70 times in that decade throughout the 1970s. We're talking just general conference, right? We're not talking church news posts. We're not talking about apostles visiting state conferences or like any of the other venues or even the Ensign, right? And what was it called? New Era, and all these things. So just in general conference addresses in the 70s, there were over 70 mentions. In the 80s, it dipped down. It was 24 mentions. In the 90s, it was, and so when I was kind of in my teens, it was 46 times. And then in the 2000s, or the aughts, I guess we are supposed to call those the aughts, 61 times. So really ramping back up in the 2000s, almost to where it originally was in the 70s when it was first announced. Okay, and then we get into the 2010s, and it goes from 61 mentions to 40 mentions. So other than the 80s, it's the lowest number since 1970. So 40 mentions. And then in the 2020s, so 2020, 21, 22, and 23 so far, there have been 6 mentions. And if you extrapolate these, 3.5 years to get a whole decade, and if you say the same frequency of mentions in the past few years will continue throughout the 2020s. So if you were to extrapolate like that, we would be at 15 for the year, the lowest ever, right? 71, 24, 46, 61, 40 in the last decade, and then 15 this decade. So then I went a little bit deeper, only with the last decade, the 2010s, and also this current decade, the 6 mentions that we've had so far, because I wanted to try and suss out a little bit which of the mentions of Family Home Evening in a general conference address, which of them were actually admonishments or encouragements, right? Like, hey, you should do Family Home Evening, versus someone in one of their talks just saying, when I was a wee lad and we did Family Home Evening, my father once said blah, 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 right? So a reference like that or a mention is included in all these search results. So for the 2010s, I broke it down. Remember, there were 40 total mentions of Family Home Evening. Out of those 40 mentions during the entire decade of the 2010s, 25 of them were admonishments, pretty high rate. So there were some mentions and references to Family Home Evening that weren't active, encouragements. And I'm being generous here. Like I'm not only including like the thou shalt, do Family Home Evening type of things, but just anything that I felt like where church leaders were referencing it while clearly conveying this is what good Latter-day Saints do. So if there was any element of them implying that, even if they didn't word it very directly or have a call to action or anything like that, I included it in this number. So 25 out of 40 in the last decade. So then we go to this current decade that we're in, the 2020s. Again, extrapolating for a whole decade, we're only going to be at 15, which is the lowest of any of the past decades. And so, but what we're dealing with so far in the first few years is 6 actual references so far to Family Home Evening or Home Evening in General Conference. 6 references. Every single one of them was a passive reference, right? Like when I was a kid, we did Family Home Evening. So at no time in the past few years in this decade have any of the mentions to Family Home Evening been an encouragement to do it, which you might say, oh, that further supports this idea that Come Follow Me kind of replaced it. But again, not so. Why? Well, the last admonishment, I don't know if that's the right word, the last encouragement that we have to do Family Home Evening from a member of the First Presidency or the Quorum of the 12 comes from President Nelson, as it turns out, back in 2015, 4 years before Come Follow Me was announced. Here's what he said in 2015. President Nelson said, years ago, and he's referring to a 1999 thing, so at the time it was 16 years prior. He said, years ago, the First Presidency stressed the importance of quality family time. They wrote, And then, so now he's quoting the 1999 First Presidency letter. Quote, "We call upon parents to devote their best efforts to the teaching and rearing of their children in gospel principles, which will keep them close to the church. The home is the basis of a righteous life, and no other instrumentality can take its place or fulfill its essential functions in carrying forward this God-given responsibility. We counsel parents and children to give highest priority to family prayer, family home evening, gospel study and instruction, and wholesome family activities. However worthy and appropriate other demands or activities may be, they must not be permitted to displace the divinely appointed duties that only parents and families can adequately perform." So again, that was a 1999 letter. President Nelson was repeating it, that portion of it, from in 2015. And that was the last time in General Conference that a leader of the church at, the Quorum of the 12 or First Presidency told the Latter-day Saints, hey, we should be doing family home evening. So several years went by, and it is my extremely unscientific, highly anecdotal observation that, for the past decade or so, plus, family home evening was kind of on the out. Didn't really see people in church mentioning it, as much. It was being mentioned less in General Conference. It didn't seem to be getting, the attention. As a father, I wasn't really feeling the constant pressure and reminder to, hey, do family home evening. Hey, set aside Monday night. Hey, there wasn't the same cultural cohesion and cadence and commitment that I was familiar with growing up. So that's kind of the working theory in the back of my head, like, oh, because it's being mentioned less and less, the saints are prioritizing it less and less and starting to forget about it, and it's going down the memory hole, because if we're not constantly reminded of it, then we assume it's not a priority. Otherwise, God would tell the prophet to tell us. So fast forward 40 years after President Nelson referenced that 1999 letter. 4 years goes by. Nary an encouragement from the leaders of the church to do family home evening. And in late 2019, in the October General Conference, President Nelson announces, "Come follow me." And actually, excuse me, it was, did I say that right? Yeah, October 2019. And so Elder Cook went up there and explained a lot of the details after President Nelson kind of announced at a high level what was going on. Elder Cook said this. This was in the announcement in General Conference about Come Follow Me. He said, "This new Sunday schedule," talking about the shift to 2 hours, "allows more time for a home evening and to study the gospel at home on Sunday or at other times as individuals and families may choose. A family activity night could be held on Monday or at other times. To this end, leaders should continue to keep Monday evenings free from church meetings and activities. However, time spent in home evening, gospel study, and activities for individuals and families may be scheduled according to their individual circumstances." So 4 years after it was last encouraged by a church leader, home evening is mentioned again, but now in the context of this new Come Follow Me system. And it's being modified that even though the church is saying no Monday church meetings, it's kind of a laissez-faire, do it whenever you want, figure it out for yourself, adapt it to your own family. Which from one vantage point is great, because maybe dad works on Monday night, and so what's so special about Monday night? Why can't it be Thursday night? Or and so the flexibility, I think, in general is a good thing. It's not unlike shifting home and visiting teaching to ministering. The problem that comes in, of course, is that as frail and fallible humans, again, if we're not being reminded and constantly encouraged, it falls off the radar. I feel like, again, anecdotally from people I've talked to and my own observations, that ministering is not doing as great unless you're counting like, oh yeah, I sent this guy a text and, minor stuff. but the substantive connections and outreach of home teaching, which I never loved and always struggled with, to be frank, but the consistency and the cadence that it offered by having some structure was helpful for many to kind of facilitate and have that reminder, hey, this is important. Hey, let's be doing this. But it seems as then when we pull back and we're like, hey, do it whatever you want, we lose maybe the expectation of the consistency, which means then that we're losing the reminders as well. To the point where in the past, since Come Follow Me was announced, at no point have we been encouraged to have a home evening. And Mormons have a very strong amnesia, it seems, because we so prioritize the present and what we're being told now that we forget what we were told before. And so this was actually surprising to me when I found Elder Cook's announcement, and I'm like, oh, he actually mentioned home evening in the context of Come Follow Me. Again, with the flexibility and the adaptation and so forth, but nonetheless saying, hey, you should still do home evening. But nary an encouragement since that time from any of the leaders of the church. So that's nice to have mentioned it long ago, but you know, it's like when Donald Rumsfeld announced on September 10th, 2001, that the Pentagon was missing $2.3 trillion. He held a press conference. $2.3 trillion. And then the next day was 9/11. The Pentagon gets attacked at the very section of the building that contains all the accounting offices. All the records are destroyed. And no one remembers that Donald Rumsfeld admission because all the attention was put on 9/11 and everything that followed. So Rumsfeld admission went down the memory hole. So too, I think, with Elder Cook, who's like, hey guys, home evening, doesn't have to be Monday night, you can adapt it. Oh, but then here's these like 83 changes we're making. And so then we're fixated on the new stuff and the exciting whatever and what we're doing moving forward. And we forget that little nugget that was announced beforehand. And so if it's not re-inculcated, if we're not reminded, then people forget and it stops happening. Which suggests that if home evening is important, then it ought to be woven into, you know, regular encouragements and reinstituted as a cultural practice and expectation for Latter-day Saint good behavior. I think this is not unlike food storage. You know, growing up, we'd hear all kinds of stuff about food storage, and there'd be general conference talks and everything else, preparedness, and First Presidency issued a letter. They'd have that pamphlet called All Is Safely Gathered In, and it was reminder, 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 reminder. And I haven't gathered the data on this. I should probably do it. I'd probably see a similar insight, but I'm going to guess, again, based off of anecdote and experience, that references to this have fallen off a cliff, like with abortion, like with family home evening. And so on the one hand, you may say, well, it's a sifting of the saints, right? Like the what are they called? The wise virgins are putting that oil in their lamps and they're doing what they need to. And we can't hold everyone's hand all the time to always be, you know, getting them to do the right thing. I think that's a decent argument if in fact that's the strategy. I don't know if it is. I don't have access to the upper echelons of church power and meetings and so forth. But it might be that, you know, God's at the point where it's like, okay, you've had enough warnings, and like in the Book of Mormon, right? Telling certain prophets, hey, you tried, you warned the people, now it's time for you to stop warning them, and they have to suffer the consequences of their failure to do it. That's certainly plausible. That could very much be what's happening right now. Who knows? And if it's not, if that's not the intentional thing that's happening, then one might argue that it would be helpful for church leaders to continue to reinforce and remind the things that are expected so that more people will develop the habit and flex that muscle and start to get the muscle memory so that they can weave that into their life as a consistent thing. Otherwise, this stuff just kind of like, blah, like, you know, dissolves away. And I don't know, maybe there's some people out there who are religiously holding home evening every week and I just don't hear about it. Maybe you do. I'd love to know in the comments if your experience and perspective differs from my own. But it does feel like it's fallen out of priority. And I don't know. I think, like with many things, It's like Joseph Smith, right? When he was trying to roll off the authority onto the quorum of the 12, and he wanted to just say, okay, my work is done. It's now on you. I can, be relieved of that burden. Like it is ultimately up to us to pick up that burden and say, hey, if this kind of stuff is important, whether it's food storage or, holding a home evening once a week and having a more intentional family religious practice to shield our kids from the pressures of the world and Babylon and everything. Like, ultimately, that's our responsibility, right? Saints who are commanded in all things are slothful servants. And yet, as I've talked about on many other issues on this podcast, if we're not reminded in all these things, we stop doing them. And I don't know what that means. At the end of the day, it may mean that a lot of people are going to be sifted away. There's a lot more tares than wheat. That when that sifting happens, we're going to be shocked at how few wheat there is, kind of the core faithful who are, religiously doing what they ought to. There might be an abundance of mercy and grace for those who were well-meaning and a little bit foolish in not storing up oil, but they're given an opportunity for deathbed repentance, as it were. I don't know. And I don't have a strong side here because I struggled with home teaching. I never really liked being forced to have this companionship and assigned to this person. I preferred a more organic approach where you just kind of look out for your neighbors and everyone looks out for your neighbors type of thing. And, family home evening growing up, my parents tried a lot, but 4 boys in the family, it was often, would devolve into a wrestling match and someone would get hurt and, get sent to their room and whatnot. And so, and I've not been good, with my family about holding any type of like weekly thing. It just honestly hasn't been on my radar because that reinculcation hasn't happened. So we, do come follow me each night and we read scriptures together and say family prayer and those things. But a home evening has been a foreign concept. And so when I started thinking about this the other day, why is that? That led to the question of, maybe it's because we've been hearing less about it. And as it turns out, it's been nearly a decade since we were last encouraged to do it. So I'd be curious in the comments if you share your experience, if you concur with this one, or what your experience is. There may be a contingent of faithful saints out there who are religiously doing home evening every single week. And ultimately, obviously, like a weekly home evening is not what's going to get you into heaven. It's more about trying to orient our families around an intentional effort to follow Christ and to keep an eye single to his glory, God's glory, rather than taking on the slow stain of the sins of the world. And so if you miss a week, big deal, or if you do it every other week, great, or if it's just trying to, as I do, trying to weave it into the informal moments where you're driving in the car and someone says something and that prompts an opportunity to have a meaningful discussion or something like that. I think ultimately it just boils down to intentionality and making sure that we're not like a rudderless ship adrift at sea to be buffeted about with every wind of doctrine and so forth. We'll wrap it there. But again, if you've got a different experience, I'd love to know in the comments. This is one that I'm just pondering and what the implications of it are and what the expectations are and what that's going to look like in the years to come, if we're going to be hearing more at any point about home evening or if it's just going to fizzle away as other things have fizzled away in the past. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks, guys. See you next week.